Thanks for joining us. I'm Jennifer Franco. The House Oversight Committee holds a hearing on equal pay for men and women. Joining me now to discuss that hearing and other headlines is South Carolina Congresswoman Nancy Mace. Hi, Congresswoman. Thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me.
So you pressed World Cup champion Megan Rapinoe and House Democrats for their representation of equal pay. You're arguing compensation should be based on work and not gender. So I just want to play a clip from that hearing on what you said for our viewers to see, and then we can discuss.
So once adjusted for factors such as hours worked and compensation packages, family and marital status, the gender wage gap, I believe, is significantly smaller than what we're talking about today. And in most cases, when you look at the data, you look at context, we're talking about between 2 and 10%. So I'm not saying there's no gender wage gap. I'm not saying it's statistically unlikely women earn less than men. I'm just saying that it's not because of widespread discrimination.
Okay, so Rapinoe is suing U.S. Soccer for gender discrimination. She's still in court fights to be equal to men's soccer. So explain your position on the matter for us.
Right, and what's ironic there too is that the women's soccer team earns more per game than the men do, and we had that discussion also in that debate this morning. But two people who have the same education, working the same job, the same skills, should have the same pay regardless of their gender. And Democrats, when they talk about this issue and this massive discrimination that they claim, they don't look at all of the data and they don't take all of it into context. And context is really important because as women, many work full-time, but some work part-time, some work in the home. There's context that is missing from that data, and I do believe that the wage gap is far smaller than what they're claiming to be. And I think that's a really important distinction that we deal in facts.
All right, and aside from that legislation and that fight happening, we're also seeing Democrats pushing a pair of gun reform bills which have support from the White House. Now, one of them targets a so-called Charleston loophole, which of course is named after the massacre of 9 black churchgoers in your state in 2015. So Democrats want to change it. So essentially if somebody is trying to buy a gun, they would have to clear a background check in the 3 days that the FBI has to investigate it. Otherwise, they could get denied. So do you think that this would help curb gun violence, like the Democrats are saying it would?
It wouldn't. And the events of Mother Emanuel that happened 5.5 years ago were horrific and heartbreaking, like the violence that we saw unfold in Boulder, Colorado, and last week Atlanta. These are horrific events. And we oftentimes see the left, we see Democrats never letting a good crisis go to waste. And these pieces of legislation do not solve the problem and would never have prevented oftentimes this violence from actually occurring. And it goes back to my theory that we've got to deal in facts and not fiction when dealing about these issues. And we're only learning now that this case on Monday in Boulder, Colorado, that there may potentially have been major mental health issues going on here. And so the other thing that we're learning too is the FBI might have been aware of this individual. And so when you peel back the onion and you look at the actual root cause of the violence, oftentimes mental health issues arise, but also information on criminals is not in one place for the FBI always to do a quick background check. This is 2021. Our information, when you're doing a background check, shouldn't take 3-5 days or even a month. I mean, this should be done within a few minutes if all of our information was in one place. And so I want to get to the heart of the problem. I want to solve the problem without violating the rights, the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens.
Are Republicans working on any sort of counter to that to address what you just mentioned?
This is an issue that I actually have worked on at the state level. I learned after Mother Emanuel, after Parkland, Florida, that many states' information, whether that's their state law enforcement division, their courts, their state trooper databases, none of that information is actually shared with other agencies freely, willingly, or quickly. At the federal level, I have co-sponsored legislation with my colleague out of Myrtle Beach, Congressman Tom Rice, to allow, when you're doing a background check right now, you can't even use the internet or email, you can only fax. Again, we need to update our communication systems and allow the FBI to do their job.
Right.
And do it in a quick manner.
Right. Time is always of the essence when you're discussing these sort of things. And I want to shift gears. Senators held a hearing earlier on sweeping election reform legislation that passed in the House. The Democrats are arguing that these changes are needed to make sure that voting is easy and accessible to those who qualify, but then we're also hearing from Republicans say that it's ripe for fraud. So what specifically in the bill concerns you that maybe Democrats aren't being transparent about how the changes would actually impact voting in actuality and not just in text?
Right. Well, in many states, and states actually, they determine their election law, not the federal government. It's actually unconstitutional to federalize the election process at the state, federal, or local level. This particular issue that we're talking about with Democrats, and I'm seeing it today, there's a significant hypocrisy. Speaker Pelosi right now this week even is trying to overturn the results of a legally certified, duly elected member, Marionette Miller Meeks. They are seeking to decide this election in Washington with politicians in D.C. rather than the voters of Iowa. And, you know, this particular issue, if this goes through, if this gets rammed through, it's going to change elections in our country forever. And that was not the purpose of it. The states actually have the ability to determine how their elections are handled. Now, one thing I do want to mention, you take voter ID for example, Democrats want to eliminate voter ID. I mean, they want to make it easier to vote than buy a pack of cigarettes in this country. And that's just wrong.
Right, and I've heard a lot of Republicans share those concerns, and compared to other countries where they're saying, you know, it's not necessarily a bad thing to ask for credentials for people to verify their identity, and they're saying that it actually does not disenfranchise people. Democrats, though, still arguing that it does. What's your response to that?
Look, if you got to show an ID to buy a beer, you should have to show an ID to vote. The other thing that they're talking about, too, is mass mail-in balloting. We saw this election cycle, mass mail-in ballots being sent to voters in other states that were registered in another state, and they were actually registered in 2 states. And so when you have that, there is propensity for voter fraud, more propensity for voter fraud with mass mail-in ballots and in-person voting with an ID. If you're doing mass mail-in balloting, there should be a witness signature to that as well, and that you should be able to match those signatures. And so we've got to make sure that Congress understands the role of the federal government, what its role is and is not, and determining how elections are handled, like the state of South Carolina. I don't want California determining how we vote. We did a really good job in November to make sure we get free and fair elections, and I want to make sure the federal government doesn't impede that.
All right. South Carolina Representative Nancy Mace taking the time to speak with us today. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.